Are we on? What is worship?
In order to get a little deeper of an understanding of what this question actually means, we decided to go out into our community and just ask a couple of our friends what worship actually means to them.
Worship to me is praising God and Jesus Christ.
I think what worship really is and where it starts is by being intentional about pursuing a relationship or pursuing something intentionally. So that's what I think.
Worship to me is a decision to live life for Christ in all aspects of what you do.
Worship to me is the belief that God is real, and when you live a lifestyle that God is real, you live it in the way that you speak to people, in the way that you think, and even in the way that you worship at church. Is it with abandon? Is it with vulnerability? Personally, worship has been for me these past few years is trusting God with whatever's going on in my life. There's been a lot of change going on, and I think that something that a lot of Christians need to work on to help with worship in a whole sense is being able to trust God with your feelings and with what's going on, because that will help you gain more insight and more breakthrough in the throne room.
Worship to me means living my life out as a sacrifice for who God has made me to be, and constantly thinking about what He's done for me and just living that out and living my full purpose for God.
It means a fearless life lived for the glory and in the presence of God.
To me, worship is pursuing an active lifestyle which reflects the glory of God.
Worship to me is anything you do actively in the pursuit of glorifying the Father. Whether that be surfing or snowboarding or talking to friends or making people laugh or playing music on a stage in front of a congregation. Worship to me is any time that you are truly and wholly interacting with the Father and using the gifts and blessings that He has given you to glorify Him and to bring the love and the joy and the peace and the patience and the kindness and the goodness and the gentleness and the self-control that is from the Holy Spirit into the communities around the world.
After hearing the answers to these questions, we decided to dig a little deeper into what the word worship actually means and also examine a little bit of the history of worship and where it originated. Worship is defined as adoration and reverence for a deity. Now, this is the dictionary definition of the word worship, but I believe that worship goes a lot farther than just a definition in the dictionary. I personally believe that worship is more of a lifestyle. It's just overall a way to live your life. But worship is a very broad subject that covers a lot of different things. There's a lot of different ways to worship. For me, one of them is singing. For Philip and Brian, maybe this is through playing basketball or soccer. For Mr. Moore, that would be through painting. For other people, that would be through dancing. But overall, I believe that worship is a lifestyle and that it's just a way that we should live our whole life every day. Every day we're worshiping God. Every day, everything that we do is an act of worship towards the Lord. So, worship is a lifestyle.
The word worship is mentioned in the Bible 8,629 times. The first recording is in Genesis 4:26 and the story of Cain and Abel. After everything happens between Cain and Abel, everyone is in a depressed state and everyone is just feeling down. After all this happens, God decides to bless Adam with a son named Seth. It's recorded that after Adam's wife bears his son, all the men gather around and start worshiping and calling on the name of the Lord. And this is the first act of worship.
In addition to the history and etymology of the word worship, we decided to look up some Bible verses that pertains to worship, and we just looked into how they could apply to our daily lives.
The second half of 1 Chronicles talks about how David was an ideal king for Israel. Now, he wasn't perfect by any means, but he lived every day
to glorify God. Now chapter 16, verse 23 says, "Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Proclaim his salvation day after day." King David is a great example of how we should worship through our everyday lives. A lot of my friends are on worship teams at school or at church. And a lot of times I feel like they worship God better than me because they can sing or play an instrument well. But 1 Chronicles tells me that that's not true. David worshiped God through his everyday life, and so can I, through basketball or through NHS or different clubs or sports teams I'm on. If I glorify God through how I participate in those, that's the same as worshiping him through song.
In Luke chapter 4, verse 8, Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." In this context, Jesus is actually being tempted by Satan himself. Satan had led Jesus up to a high point and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and said, "If you worship me, Jesus, you can have it all." Now, I don't think any of us have ever been personally tempted to worship Satan himself, but we are often tempted to worship things of this world. For me, that looks like spending too much time on my phone on social media, maybe putting my girlfriend as a higher priority than God, or even chasing after the wealth of this world and worrying too much about that. My takeaway from reading Luke 4, verse 8 specifically, was that Jesus was tempted by Satan himself, as I said before. And now Jesus was fully man. We know that. We've been taught that. And so if Jesus was able to withstand face-to-face tempts from the devil, I know that when I'm tempted to do silly things like maybe, cheat on a math test or lie, I know that I can withstand that and I can worship God and say, no, I'm going to follow God and do the right thing. And I think for me personally, that's such a good reassurance, is that Jesus came and he was fully man and he was able to stand up to the wiles of the devil. And I just think that's awesome.
1 Peter chapter 2 says, "Coming to him as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious, you also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." Later on in this chapter it says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy but now have obtained mercy." God chose to restore our lifeless beings and turn us into living stones of him. In return to this gift he gave us of life, we should praise him with our lives, being selfless in everything, putting on humility when we find ourselves in a high position, and above all, loving others as Christ loved us, and this will all glorify him. Because God turned us into living stones of him, he gave us his Spirit, and the Spirit desires to worship him. It desires to praise him in everything we do.
Psalm 95 says, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God." Now, this psalm is mostly about praising God for all that he's done for us, and just exalting him above all of creation, because this is what God has given us, and he made this for us. And so it's our job here on earth to just give all thanks and praise to God for what he has given us.
So I know some people can just flip through the Bible and read verse after verse and understand exactly what it's trying to tell them. But for people like me who can't do that, I have taken worship and pulled out 3 little aspects of worship just for you guys to take home and just think about. So here they are.
When someone hears the word worship, they usually think of worship through song. But what does that really mean? In Psalm 98, we are called to make a joyful noise to the Lord. I believe when we position our hearts into the posture of worship, we are submitting to the authority of God and lifting him up for all he has done, is doing, and will carry on to do. Worship through song can be perceived as a concert-like ordeal, but in reality it should be a time of praising the Lord, because He is good and He is worthy of our praise.
Fellowship, by definition, is friendly association, especially with people who share one's interests. A good example of genuine fellowship is seen in the first Lord of the Rings movie. Frodo and the others who made up the Fellowship of the Ring certainly shared many adventures together, but their partnership involved far more than simple companionship. Because of what they went through together, they came to know each other better and on a deeper level. They formed incredibly strong bonds of friendship, and they sacrificed much for one another, often enduring hardship and, in some instances, even death.
Spending personal, devotional time with God is one of the most important things we can do as Christians. Planning that time daily with God is essential because as humans we tend to get distracted and overwhelmed with the things that life brings. Giving our undivided attention during personal devotions is how one would bring a worshipful attitude into devotional time. Turning your phone off, or maybe setting yourself in a corner in your room with all the doors shut, just to make sure you're really focused on God, is important because it's so easy to get distracted as humans and it's so easy to miss the mark. And we want to give God everything, especially during personal devotional time.
Hey, Miss Henry. Thank you so much for all you did this year, for coming and taking over our Bible program. I'm so sorry for all the crap we put you through and for the disruptions we had in class. And hope that you're back next year and have a great summer.
Reba?
Ahoy there. Hope you enjoyed. Worship!